What's up, everybody? It's Izzy, and in this video I want to talk about an interesting topic that I got from a Mark Bell video the other day, and he was basically training with Swole Izzy from Instagram, and the whole video was basically about adjusting her bench grip width in terms of narrowing it from a super wide grip to something that gave her a little bit more, or in his words, better leverage. So the idea was that in powerlifting, with a lot of techniques, there is a trade-off between shortening the range of motion and improving the leverage of the movement. And I thought that this was a really interesting idea and a really interesting topic because, to a large extent, right, this is somewhat true. However, what's difficult about this is that there's no real way to tell what's going to work best for a particular lifter. So, for example, in the bench press, you could have a super wide grip, a maximum legal grip width, and this is going to be the grip width which obviously shortens the range of motion as much as it possibly can be legally shortened within the rules. However, this is going to do an interesting thing to the joints in the movement. The wrist is no longer going to be directly above the elbow, so you're going to create a moment arm along the forearm between the wrist and the elbow, and you're going to lose some efficiency there in exchange for a shorter range of motion, right? And with a wider grip in general, with more elbow flare, you're not going to be able to rest your triceps on your lats for a better pressing base in the bottom of the lift. Now, many of you might not have big enough lats to do that even with a super close grip, so that might not be relevant, but it is a relevant consideration for some of the bigger lifters out there. And we can think of similar examples on this one with the squat and the deadlift as well. With a super wide squat stance, you can definitely cut down on the range of motion because you simply don't have to go down as far before your hip crease goes below the knee, especially if the wide stance helps you limit your forward knee travel, which for many people it does. However, the cost of this is that it usually makes you weaker right out of the bottom of the squat because, your knees and ankles will no longer be as close to your hips, creating a moment arm from there, right? And if you're wide enough, maybe your ankle will not be below your knee either. And this is definitely true in a super wide sumo deadlift. And if you haven't seen my video on the different types of sumo deadlifts with the narrow sumo and the moderate sumo and the wide stance sumo, you can find that on this page. But, the basic point was that as you go wider and wider with your sumo stance, it reaches a point where eventually you start creating moment arms in exchange for decreasing the range of motion. So the example that I already brought up was, with a super wide sumo stance, the ankle will not be below the knee and the knee will not be below the hip joint. Whereas in a conventional deadlift, typically a person will have all three of those joints stacked on top of each other. And that's kind of a catchphrase that's popular is, stacking the joints. And anyway, the point that I really want to raise here is that in most cases, technical adjustments that you need to make and technical optimizations are going to be a trade-off between reducing the range of motion further and improving the leverage. There are only a few technical adjustments that you can make that both decrease the range of motion and improve your leverage. So some examples of this might be, let's say somebody has a deadlift grip that's simply too wide. It's not perpendicular to the floor, and there's no reason for it to be that wide. Because, sometimes people have to take a wider grip to fit a little bit wider stance or something like that. But let's say that's just a needlessly wide deadlift grip, something that you kind of commonly see with beginners. Well, if you narrow their grip, it will both reduce the range of motion and improve the leverages in the movement because, their hips will start slightly higher, their knee will have a more open knee angle, and in general, for most people, this is a change that both decreases the range of motion and improves the leverage. So for most people, and in most situations, it's a pretty straightforward win, and it's the proper technical optimization to make. Another example might be low bar versus high bar squats. Typically, you're going to have a shorter range of motion with a low bar squat because the bar sits lower on your back and you don't have as much forward knee travel before you reach the end of your hamstrings, which allows you to reach the end of your hamstrings extensibility a little sooner, meaning that most low bar squats, even when you hit your natural bottom point, are higher than your natural bottom point with the high bar squat. And this can also improve your leverage for some people. In fact, most people, because with the bar being carried lower, you're going to have a smaller moment arm along your back, and it'll be easier to complete the lift because you won't have to produce as much hip torque. So there are some examples of technical changes in powerlifting that both improve your leverage and decrease the range of motion. I've talked about one for deadlift, one for squat, and an example on the bench press might be arching your back. Arching your back will generally decrease the range of motion without negatively impacting any of the joint angles. Where things start to get tricky and where things start to become more individual, and even though some of the things that I've already mentioned are individual, right? Because certain people can't handle low bar, and certain people need a wider deadlift grip, maybe because of back issues, maybe because of windmilling on the underhand. So there's exceptions to even the things that I've already said. But for the most part, optimizing your technique on the individual level will come down to finding a balance between stacking the joints, so to speak, versus cutting down the range of motion. So in the bench press, the optimal grip width in terms of your leverages will put your elbows directly underneath your wrists. And so in other words, in the bottom position of the bench press, your forearms would be perpendicular to the ground. However, this is also the grip width which has the longest range of motion about the shoulder joint. So there's the trade-off there. And similarly, in the squat, a narrower stance will allow you to have your ankles and knees closer to your hips. It'll allow you to rebound off of your legs out of the bottom of the hole if your stomach contacts your legs. But this is also the longest range of motion for the squat. And again, we can kind of come back down to the same thing with deadlifts, whereas a conventional deadlift does quote unquote stack the joints and it puts the hips, knees, and ankles all in alignment if you're doing it properly with a narrow stance. But it may not be better than a sumo deadlift for somebody simply because the sumo deadlift reduces the range of motion and changes the emphasis of which musculature is dominant throughout the movement pattern. And again, you can take that further with the sumo deadlift and think of a moderate sumo stance where at least the ankles are still underneath the knees when when the stance is set up fully. So when they open their knees, the knee is still right on top of the ankle joint. However, there's plenty of cases of people who take a max width sumo stance, and this is where they feel that they lift the most weight. So I suppose there's not a real point to the video that I'm making here, other than this. When you're experimenting with finding the optimal technique for you, the two extremes that you want to play with are the shortest range of motion possible, and then the stance width and the grip width that allows you to perfectly, quote unquote, stack the joints. So anything in between those is where individualization is going to come into play, personal preference, training time with a particular style. But those are the two extremes that you can start from and then work from there to see what personally works best for you. So unlike maybe what I've said in the past, I really don't believe that there's a technique out there that's best for everybody. However, these are the two extremes that everybody should try to see what works best for them. The one that cuts the range of motion down the most, and the one that perfectly stacks the joints, like again, air quotes with that phrase again, and which one of those feels better, and then you can start to individualize with small changes from there. Anyways, I hope you guys got the point of the video. It wasn't really like a do this, do that type of thing, but really just more an interesting concept that I heard the other day that I felt warranted some further discussion. If you guys have any questions about what I'm talking about in the video here, or you just want to ask me something about this topic, feel free to do so in the comments. As always, my friends, have a nice day and good luck with your training. Peace.